The sandstorm hit Helmand Province like a wall of ground glass, turning noon into twilight and visibility into a guessing game. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reeves pressed his back against the compound wall, feeling the ancient mud brick crumble slightly under his body armor. 20 meters ahead, 3 Taliban fighters were repositioning a PKM machine gun, and his team of 12 Marines was pinned in a kill box that was getting smaller by the minute. The radio crackled with static and desperation. Higher headquarters had already told them what they knew in their guts. The quick reaction force couldn't launch in this weather, the Apache were grounded, and the nearest ground convoy was 4 hours out through IED Alley. Reeves watched his ammo counter drop to double digits and did the math that every infantry marine learns to hate. They had maybe 20 minutes before this became Alamo mathematics. Then the radio broke through with a voice that sounded like it was coming from inside a washing machine full of gravel. Kodiak 2-1, this is Hog 6-3, single ship inbound your position, 5 mics out. Reeves exchanged glances with Corporal Davies, whose face said what they were both thinking. One A-10 in a sandstorm was either the bravest thing they'd ever heard or the stupidest. The Warthog wasn't known for weather flying. It was known for being a flying tank that turned other tanks into scrap metal, but this kind of visibility was suicide for close air support. Hog 6-3, be advised this is near zero, we can barely see 50 meters, Reeves transmitted back, trying to keep the doubt out of his voice. The response came calm and unhurried, with an accent that suggested somewhere in the Carolinas. Copy all, Kodiak, I've flown worse. Something in that voice made Reeves believe it. The A-10 appeared like a gray ghost materializing from the storm, flying so low that its turbofans kicked up secondary dust clouds that briefly cleared the air. Reeves saw it bank hard left, the distinctive profile of those twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, the nose painted with teeth that looked more resigned than aggressive after years of desert sun. Whoever was flying that aircraft had just done something the manual explicitly prohibited: terrain-masked approach in instrument meteorological conditions with no visual reference. The Taliban fighters saw it too. Half a second before the GAU-8 Avenger cannon spoke its 7-syllable sentence of depleted uranium. The sound arrived after the effect, which was how it always worked with the Warthog's gun. By the time Reeves heard the BRRRT that would become legendary in every retelling, 3 enemy positions had simply ceased to exist. The A-10 climbed back into the sandstorm like it had never been there at all, leaving only the smell of cordite and churned earth. Kodiak 2-1, Hog 6-3, say BDA, the radio requested. Reeves stared at the smoking craters where the machine gun nest had been. Hog 6-3, that's 3 KIA confirmed, immediate threat neutralized. You just saved 12 lives. There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Reeves wondered if the connection had dropped. Roger that, Kodiak. Stay safe down there. The voice was professional, almost distant, like this was just another Tuesday. It wasn't until later, back at Camp Leatherneck during the debrief, that Reeves learned the pilot's call sign. Hog 6-3 was Captain Nora Kine, call sign Boomerang, and she'd been flying A-10s for 6 years with a reputation that preceded her like a weather system. The intelligence officer who briefed them said it matter-of-factly, like gender was just another data point on the mission summary. But Reeves saw the looks exchanged between some of the senior NCOs, the kind of looks that asked questions without words. A female pilot doing single-ship gun runs in zero visibility wasn't in anyone's playbook. The brief continued with tactical details and threat assessments, but Reeves found himself studying the mission imagery from the Lightning targeting pod, watching the gun camera footage that showed just how close Boomerang had flown to their position. The next call came 3 days later during a village sweep operation that went sideways when a supposed informant led them into a coordinated ambush. This time it was Captain Torres on the radio, calling for any available air, and this time the response was almost immediate. Reaper 3-4, Hog 6-3 with a full combat load, 12 minutes out. Torres, who'd flown Cobra gunships in his previous life, actually smiled. Hog 6-3, Reaper 3-4, we are danger close with concentrations in multiple buildings, how copy? The reply came back with that same Carolina drawl, measured and calm. Copy danger close. I'll make it work. Boomerang came in from the east this time, with actual visibility but worse tactical geometry. The enemy had fortified positions in structures that were right on top of the Marine positions, the kind of scenario that made artillery useless and made most pilots understandably cautious. The A-10 overflew once in a wheel pattern, and Reeves could imagine her up there, assessing angles and backdrops, doing the geometry that separated acceptable risk from recklessness. When she rolled in, it was with Maverick missiles first, precision shots that took out a mortar position without touching the adjacent mosque. Then she came back with the gun, stitching a line of 13 fire through a window that intelligence had identified as a sniper position. The whole engagement lasted 4 minutes. The Marines counted 11 confirmed enemy KIA and 0 civilian casualties in a dense urban environment. Word started spreading through the battalion after that. The A-10 driver who flew like she had something to prove, which some people meant as a compliment and others didn't. Reeves heard the whispers in the chow hall, the way some guys said female pilot like it was 2 words that didn't belong together, like competence had a gender requirement. It made him angry in a way that was hard to articulate, because he'd been on the receiving end of her competence twice now, and it looked identical to survival. The third mission was the one that changed everything. Second platoon got hit during a resupply convoy movement, ambushed in a wadi with high ground on both sides and no cover except the vehicles themselves. The Taliban had planned it perfectly, waiting until the convoy was strung out and vulnerable, then opening up with everything they had. Lieutenant Hammond was screaming into the radio for air support, any air support, while his Marines tried to return fire against an enemy they mostly couldn't see. The response board at headquarters showed everything red. Apache committed to another tick 40 clicks north, fast movers on station but Winchester on precision munitions. A Marine Harrier diverted to a troops in contact situation in Sangin. Then Boomerang's voice cut through the chaos. Any station, Hog 6-3, I'm 10 minutes out with full stores, who needs help? The JTAC, a seasoned sergeant named Williams who controlled more airstrikes than most people had hot meals, felt something unclench in his chest. Hog 6-3, Reaper 2-6, we have troops in contact, complex ambush, taking effective fire from elevated positions both sides of the wadi. Williams rattled off the coordinates and friendly positions, watching his guys getting chewed up while he painted the tactical picture. Boomerang's response was textbook calm. Copy all, Reaper. I'll be your fire extinguisher today. She came in low and fast, the A-10's titanium bathtub cockpit glinting in the late afternoon sun. Williams talked her eyes onto the western ridgeline first, where the heaviest fire was coming from. Cleared hot, western ridge, troops 200 meters east marked by yellow smoke. He'd barely finished the sentence before Boomerang was in her dive, the dropping like it had forgotten how to fly, pulling out so low that Williams swore he could see her helmet through the canopy. The gun run was surgical, walking 13 rounds along the ridgeline in bursts that sounded like the sky tearing. 3 fighting positions disappeared in clouds of pulverized rock and spent brass casings that rained down like metallic hail. But it was the eastern ridge that became the problem. 2 RPG teams were positioned in caves that were almost impossible to hit without danger-close gun runs that would put Boomerang well inside the envelope of small arms fire. Williams could hear it in his voice when he passed the target description, the apology embedded in the tactical language. Hog 6-3, be advised eastern targets are extremely danger close and in hardened positions, recommend we. Boomerang cut him off mid-sentence. Reaper 2-6, I see them, rolling in hot. What happened next was the kind of flying that Williams would describe in bars for the rest of his life, and people would call exaggeration. Boomerang brought the A-10 down parallel to the wadi floor, flying at what couldn't have been more than 50 feet, using the terrain to mask her approach until she was directly below the cave positions. Then she pulled into a nearly vertical climb, pivoted the aircraft on what seemed like a dinner plate of sky, and came back down in a dive angle that put her cannon bore-sighted directly into the cave mouths. The gun sang its short, terrible song twice, and both RPG teams ceased to be a problem. She pulled out in a climbing turn that had to have stressed the airframe, because Williams heard one of his Marines say, "Jesus Christ, she's gonna pull the wings off." The ambush broke after that. The Taliban fighters who were left decided that continuing the fight against an A-10 pilot who flew like physics was a suggestion, was not a winning proposition. They melted back into the hills the way they always did, leaving their dead and some weapons they couldn't carry. Hammond's platoon had taken casualties but no KIAs, which in that kind of killbox was as close to a miracle as infantry combat provided. Williams sat in the dirt after the medevac birds left, his hands shaking from adrenaline dump, and tried to write up the 9 line for the close air support mission. How did you quantify what just happened? How did you put in a report that a pilot had essentially said, "Fuck the safety margins," and meant it as a tactical decision rather than bravado? The debrief at the forward operating base drew a crowd. Word had spread that Boomerang had done something exceptional, and Marines had a tribal appetite for stories about people who did the impossible and made it look routine. The battalion air officer, a major who'd flown Hornets off carriers before switching to a staff job, reviewed the gun camera footage with an expression that cycled through disbelief, concern, and grudging admiration. "Captain Kine," he said slowly, freezing the image at the moment Boomerang had pulled into that vertical climb, "this is some of the most aggressive low-level flying I've ever seen. It's also about 15 different violations of standing procedures." Boomerang, who'd flown in for the debrief and stood in the back of the room still wearing her flight suit, didn't look apologetic. "Sir, the procedures assume you're more worried about your aircraft than the guys on the ground. I had a different priority list today." The major studied her for a long moment. You could feel the room holding its breath, waiting to see if this was going to become a career-ending conversation. Finally, the major nodded. "Get that priority list put together real quick next time, Captain. Those Marines are going to want to buy you a beer and I need you alive to drink it." The room exhaled collectively, and just like that the moment passed. But something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed. The Marines who'd been in that wadi now had a story, and stories were the currency that mattered. Reeves saw Boomerang later that evening near the flight line, doing her post-flight walk-around in the fading light. He approached carefully, suddenly unsure of what to say to someone who'd saved his life twice and his brother's lives once more. She noticed him coming and straightened up from inspecting the A-10's landing gear, wiping hydraulic fluid off her hands with a rag that had seen better days. "Staff Sergeant," she acknowledged, her voice carrying that same measured calm it had over the radio. Up close, she looked tired in the way that people got when adrenaline debt came due, with the kind of exhaustion that lived behind the eyes. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you," Reeves started, then stopped because the words felt inadequate. "For the sandstorm run and today, you didn't have to fly like that." Boomerang smiled, but it was a complicated expression. "Actually, I kind of did. You guys don't get to choose when the Taliban decides to ruin your day. Somebody has to show up." There was philosophy in that statement, a world view compressed into casual words. Reeves understood it immediately because he lived it too. You didn't get to pick your battles in Afghanistan. The battles picked you, and then you dealt with them using whatever tools you had. "Why Boomerang?" he asked, then immediately worried he'd overstepped. Call signs were personal and asking about them could be complicated, but Boomerang just laughed, a sound that seemed surprised to escape. "Because in flight school, I kept coming back to problems everyone else avoided. Difficult approaches, bad weather, the training scenarios instructors used to wash people out. I'd come back at them until I figured them out." She paused, looking at the A-10 behind her, its battle-scarred exterior visible even in the dying light. "Also, because I've had more than one guy tell me I should quit and go fly transports, and I keep coming back anyway." The bitterness in that last sentence was barely there, just a trace element, but Reeves heard it. He thought about the looks in the briefing room, the whispers, the way some people said female pilot like it needed an asterisk. Their loss, he said simply. Boomerang met his eyes, and something passed between them that was older than rank or gender or branch of service. It was the recognition that combat didn't care about politics or prejudice, that results were binary, and that she delivered results that kept Marines breathing. Over the following weeks, Boomerang's reputation crystallized into something more than rumor. She flew 23 more combat missions during that deployment rotation, each one adding layers to the legend. There was the time she stayed on station for 4 hours past her fuel bingo, cycling back to the tanker 3 times, because a special forces team was pinned down and she was the only air support they had. There was the mission where she expended all her ordnance, then made dry gun passes just to keep enemy heads down while a medevac extracted wounded. There was the night mission where she flew entirely on instruments through a thunderstorm because a Marine reconnaissance team had walked into a hornet's nest and needed anyone, to show up. The stories accumulated like layers of paint, each one adding texture to the picture. And slowly, incrementally, the nature of the whispers changed. Female pilot became that A-10 driver who doesn't quit became Boomerang, the one you want when everything goes sideways. The transformation wasn't universal or instant. There were still guys who couldn't separate their prejudices from the evidence of their own eyes, still NCOs who used her gender as a qualifier every time they mentioned her name. But among the Marines who'd been on the ground when she showed up, among the men who'd counted rounds and calculated odds, and then heard that Carolina drawl cut through the radio static, the equation was simpler. She kept them alive. Everything else was noise. Reeves ended up working with a Navy SEAL team during the last month of deployment, attached as a liaison for a joint operation in the northern Helmand River Valley. The SEALs had their own way of doing things, their own culture of quiet competence and carefully managed arrogance. They didn't impress easily, and they definitely didn't defer to anyone outside their tribe. So Reeves was interested when the team leader, a senior chief named Kowalski who looked like he'd been carved from granite and bad decisions, asked him about close air support assets during mission planning. Usually run with our own birds, Kowalski said, meaning the Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, but they're committed to another package. We're looking at standard Air Force and Marine Air. You got anybody you'd request specifically? Reeves didn't hesitate. There's an A-10 pilot call sign Boomerang out of Bagram. If she's available, get her. Kowalski raised an eyebrow. That the one I've been hearing about, the one who supposedly flew through a sandstorm blind. Reeves shook his head. Not supposedly, I was there, and that's the tamest thing she's done. The mission was a direct action raid on a compound suspected of housing a high-value target with links to the Haqqani network. Intelligence suggested heavy security, hardened positions, and a high probability of complex attack. The kind of operation where everything that could go wrong usually did, and the only question was how fast you could adapt. The SEAL team went in at 300, fast-roping from helicopters that disappeared into the darkness before the sound could wake the whole valley. They had maybe 4 minutes before surprise turned into a gunfight. They got 3. The compound exploded into violence with tracer fire and RPGs, and suddenly Kowalski's team was fighting room to room against defenders who'd clearly been expecting trouble. The radio traffic was clipped and professional, SEALs calling out contacts and movements with the efficiency of people who'd done this too many times to waste words. But underneath the professionalism, Reeves could hear the strain. They were outnumbered, and the compound's construction was turning every room into a potential kill zone. Kowalski made the call. All stations, Trident 6, we need close air support, danger close, how copy? Boomerang answered before the air support coordinator could respond. Trident 6, Hog 6-3, overhead your position, ready to work. Kowalski's voice carried a note of surprise. Hog 6-3, we didn't know you were on station. There was a slight pause before Boomerang replied, and Reeves could hear the smile in her voice. "Trident, I heard you guys were doing something interesting tonight. Thought I'd hang around just in case." What followed was a masterclass in close air support under conditions that made the textbook obsolete. The compound was surrounded by civilian structures, meaning every weapon release had to be surgical. The SEALs were moving constantly, flowing through the compound in a tactical ballet that required the air support to update friendly positions in real time. And the enemy was using the buildings themselves as cover, firing from windows and doorways that required precision strikes at angles that most pilots wouldn't attempt. Boomerang handled it like she was conducting an orchestra. She talked Kowalski through each attack run before she made it, painting the picture of where her ordnance would impact, asking about friendly positions with questions that demonstrated she understood ground tactics as well as any infantry officer. When she finally rolled in with a Maverick missile to take out a fortified machine gun position, she did it from an attack angle that seemed to defy geometry, coming in nearly perpendicular to the building to minimize collateral damage. The missile went through a second-story window and exploded inside, containing the blast within the structure. 30 seconds later, the SEALs cleared the building and confirmed the target destroyed with 0 civilian casualties. Kowalski's next transmission was 2 words: "Hog beautiful." The operation lasted 43 minutes from insertion to extraction. Boomerang stayed overhead for all of it, cycling through different weapons systems as the tactical situation evolved. She used her cannon for suppression fires that kept enemy reinforcements at bay. She dropped a pair of 500-pound JDAMs on an external fighting position that was anchoring the defensive response. And when the SEALs needed to extract through an alley that was covered by fire from multiple angles, she made a low pass that was more psychological warfare than actual attack. The A-10's distinctive profile and engine sound, sending defenders scrambling for cover long enough for the team to reach their extraction point. After the helicopters pulled the team out and disappeared back into the night, Boomerang stayed on station for another 20 minutes, making sure no pursuit was organized, no secondary ambush was waiting. Only when the Tactical Operations Center confirmed the team was clear of the immediate area did she finally bank away and head back to Bagram. Reeves, listening to the radio traffic from the TOC, heard Kowalski's final transmission to her. "Hog 6-3, Trident 6. That was some of the finest CAS work I've ever seen. You've got a beer waiting whenever you want to collect." There was a pause before Boomerang responded, longer than her usual crisp acknowledgments. "Trident 6, Hog 6-3, just doing my job. Glad everyone made it home." The humility in that statement was genuine, but Reeves heard something else underneath it too. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. The knowledge that she'd done something difficult and done it perfectly, and that the people whose lives depended on it recognized it. That kind of validation couldn't be faked or awarded. It had to be earned in moments where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in meters and milliseconds. The next morning, Kowalski found Reeves at the operations center reviewing after-action reports. The senior chief looked like he'd had about 3 hours of sleep, which was probably 2 more than the rest of his team. "Your A-10 pilot," Kowalski said without preamble. "Boomerang. She available for tasking again if we need her." Reeves looked up from the reports. "You'd have to check with the Air Force, but knowing her, if you call, she'll show up." Kowalski nodded slowly. "We've worked with a lot of air assets over the years, a lot of good pilots, but that," he paused, searching for words, "that was different. She flew like she gave a shit whether we lived or died." "She does," Reeves said simply. There wasn't much else to say. Kowalski studied him for a moment, then seemed to come to some internal decision. "You know we don't care about the politics of it, right? Whether she's got tits or a dick, whether she's black or white or purple. We care about one thing: can you do the job when everything's on fire?" And she answered that question pretty definitively. It was the closest thing to high praise Reeves had ever heard from a SEAL. And coming from Kowalski, it might as well have been a medal ceremony. Word of the SEAL operation spread through the military grapevine, the way significant events always did. By the time Boomerang rotated back to Bagram for her scheduled rest period, her reputation had expanded beyond the Marine infantry battalions to include Special Operations Forces, who were notoriously selective about who they trusted. The air operations officer at Bagram, a lieutenant colonel who'd been flying fighters for 20 years, called Boomerang into his office for what she probably expected to be a professional discussion about her aggressive tactics and whether they needed to be reined in. Instead, he showed her a message that had come down from Special Operations Command. It was a formal request to have Captain Nora Kine, call sign Boomerang, placed on priority tasking for any special operations missions in Regional Command Southwest. The request was signed by 3 different O-6 commanders and included language about demonstrated exceptional close air support capability and tactical decision-making under extreme pressure. The lieutenant colonel watched her read it, his expression carefully neutral. You've apparently become the go-to pilot for guys who don't trust easily. Congratulations, Captain. That's not a list most people make. Boomerang read the message twice, processing what it meant. In military bureaucracy, this kind of formal request was significant. It meant that people with stars on their shoulders had noticed her, that her name was now associated with success in the highest stakes operations. It also meant that the missions would get harder, the stakes would get higher, and the margin for error would shrink to nothing. Sir, I appreciate the confidence, she said carefully, but I'm just doing what any A-10 pilot would do in the same situations. The lieutenant colonel smiled, but it wasn't quite friendly. That's where you're wrong, Captain. Most A-10 pilots would not do what you do. Most pilots, period, would not do what you do. That's why they want you specifically. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of evaluation that felt like an X-ray. The question I have is whether you understand what you're doing. Not tactically, you clearly understand the tactics, but the bigger picture. You're becoming a symbol whether you want to be or not. Every time you pull off one of these missions, every time you keep a ground team alive through flying that makes safety officers wake up screaming, you're making a statement. Boomerang met his eyes evenly. Sir, with respect, I'm not trying to make statements. I'm trying to keep people alive. I know, the lieutenant colonel said. That's what makes it work. If you were grandstanding, if this was about proving something, it would show in your decision-making. But you're making tactical choices based on the ground situation, not your ego. That's why people trust you. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. It's also why some people resent you. You're doing things they can't or won't do, and that makes them uncomfortable, especially given. He gestured vaguely, leaving the gender issue unspoken but present in the room like furniture. Boomerang had heard variations of this conversation before, from well-meaning superior officers who wanted to make sure she understood the politics of being a female pilot in combat aviation. She appreciated the intent, even if she was tired of the substance. Sir, I can't control what other people think or how they react. I can only control what I do. And what I do is fly close air support for people who need it. If that makes some people uncomfortable, that's their problem to solve, not mine. The lieutenant colonel nodded, and for the first time he smiled genuinely. Good answer. Maintain that attitude and you'll be fine. Just remember, the higher you climb, the more people will be watching, waiting for you to make a mistake they can weaponize. Don't give them ammunition. It was advice born from experience, from watching talent get undermined by politics, from knowing that the military was a meritocracy except when it wasn't. Boomerang took it for what it was, a warning from someone who'd seen how the game was played. She spent her rest period doing maintenance checks on her A-10, which was her version of relaxation. Other pilots hit the gym or played video games or wrote letters home. Boomerang walked around her aircraft with a checklist and a flashlight, looking for stress fractures and hydraulic leaks, and all the small failures that killed pilots if you didn't catch them first. The crew chief, a technical sergeant named Rodriguez who'd been maintaining Warthogs since before Boomerang learned to fly, watched her with amusement. Ma'am, that's what I'm here for. You don't have to inspect your own bird. Boomerang looked up from examining the gun barrel, which showed wear patterns from the amount of ammunition she'd been expending. I know, Rodriguez, but she's kept me alive through some interesting decisions. Least I can do is make sure she's ready for the next ones. Rodriguez appreciated that. Most pilots treated their aircraft like rental cars, useful tools that someone else maintained. The pilots who survived long enough to become legends understood that the machine was a partner, that its reliability was the foundation of everything else. She's solid, ma'am. I've been patching some battle damage from the last few missions, but nothing structural. You've been hard on her, though. Some of the G-loads you've been pulling. I'm surprised you haven't overstressed something critical. Boomerang ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets and panel seams. She's tougher than she looks. They all are. That's why I love flying them. The deployment wound down through February and into March, with the fighting tempo decreasing as the Taliban traditionally pulled back for the winter. Boomerang flew fewer missions, but the ones she did fly maintained the same standard. Get called, show up, solve the problem. She became a fixture in mission briefings, the A-10 pilot that ground commanders specifically requested when they knew the operation was going to be difficult. The respect was tangible now, no longer something she had to earn on every mission, but something that preceded her like a reputation. But respect in the military was complicated, and Boomerang learned that lesson during an awards ceremony she hadn't asked to attend. The battalion commander who'd controlled her most recent deployment had put her in for a Distinguished Flying Cross, citing her actions during the SEAL operation and 2 other missions where her flying had been instrumental in preventing friendly casualties. The citation was impressive, full of phrases like extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety. Reading it made Boomerang uncomfortable because she didn't think she'd done anything extraordinary. She'd done her job under circumstances that required her to do it well. That wasn't heroism, it was professionalism. The ceremony was held at Bagram, with representatives from multiple units attending because the story of Boomerang had spread wide enough to become common knowledge. Reeves was there, his platoon having rotated back to the main base for refit. Kowalski and his SEAL team were there, looking slightly out of place in their clean uniforms after months of operating in civilian clothes. And there were Air Force officers Boomerang had never met, including a 1-star general who'd flown down from Kabul specifically for this event. She stood at attention while the citation was read, feeling acutely aware of every eye in the room, wondering if people saw a pilot or a statement. When the general pinned the medal to her flight suit, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Captain Kine, I've been flying military aircraft for 32 years, and I've read a lot of award citations. Yours is one of the few that actually understates what happened. The men in this room are alive because you made decisions most pilots wouldn't make and executed them flawlessly. That's not about gender or politics. That's about skill, courage, and commitment. Be proud of what you've accomplished. Boomerang felt something break loose in her chest, some small barrier she'd been maintaining between herself and the validation she hadn't let herself want. Thank you, sir, she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. The general smiled, the kind of expression that suggested he understood exactly what those words cost. Now go have a beer with those Marines and SEALs. They've been waiting to buy you one for weeks. It was permission and benediction, the acknowledgement that she belonged in this tribe of people who did hard things in bad places. The bar that night was loud and crowded, with the kind of energy that came from people who'd survived things that could have killed them and wanted to celebrate that survival. Boomerang found herself surrounded by Marines and SEALs who treated her like one of their own, which was its own kind of validation. Kowalski bought the first round, then Reeves bought the second, and somewhere around the third, Boomerang lost track of who was buying and just enjoyed the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. The conversations ranged across topics with the randomness of alcohol and exhaustion, terrible food, worse living conditions, the absurdity of military bureaucracy, and the small moments of beauty that Afghanistan offered when it wasn't trying to kill you. Lieutenant Hammond, the platoon leader whose convoy Boomerang had saved in the Wadi ambush, ended up sitting next to her at some point in the evening. He was young, maybe 24, with the kind of idealism that combat hadn't completely eroded yet. "Ma'am," he said, his words careful despite the beer, "I wanted to ask you something. When you were making that gun run in the Wadi, the one where you came up from below and shot into the caves, were you scared?" It was the kind of question that required honesty, the kind young officers asked when they were trying to figure out if courage was the absence of fear or something else entirely. Boomerang considered the question seriously, giving it the weight it deserved. "Terrified," she admitted. "Every time I pull into a gun run like that, there's a voice in my head calculating all the ways it can go wrong. Mechanical failure, enemy fire, spatial disorientation, simple pilot error. The list is long." Hammond looked surprised, like he'd expected her to claim fearlessness. "Then how do you do it?" Boomerang finished her beer, setting the bottle down with deliberate care. "Because on the other side of that equation are the guys on the ground who need help. And between my fear and their survival, it's not actually a hard choice. The fear is just noise. The job is what matters." It was a philosophy compressed into a few sentences, a worldview that explained why she flew the way she did. Hammond nodded slowly, processing it with the seriousness of someone who would carry those words into his own leadership decisions. "Thank you, ma'am, that actually helps." Boomerang smiled, feeling oddly maternal despite being only a few years older than him. "You're doing fine, Lieutenant. Your Marines are alive and they trust you. That's the whole ballgame right there." The deployment ended in April, with Boomerang rotating back to her home station at Moody Air Force Base in Georgia. The transition from combat operations to peacetime routine was jarring, the way it always was for people who'd spent months operating at high intensity. Suddenly, there were uniform inspections instead of mission briefings, training sorties instead of actual combat, and safety regulations that felt absurd after what she'd been doing in Afghanistan.